There was a time when games didn't need to dominate the industry to exist. They didn't need to sell 20 million copies. They didn't need a 10-year content roadmap. They just needed to be good enough, ambitious enough, strange enough, complete enough. They lived in the middle, not in the experiments, not billion-dollar blockbusters, but something in between. And then, quietly, the middle disappeared. So, what happened to the AA game? And what does the disappearance tell us about how the industry changed? To understand that, we have to examine the structure beneath the shelf. Between 2005 and 2012, the industry operated in a very specific equilibrium. HD graphics had arrived, but production pipelines were still manageable. Teams ranged from 50 to 120 developers. Budgets hovered between $15 and $40 million. That financial window created elasticity. Publishers could greenlight projects that weren't guaranteed franchises. Mirror's Edge didn't look like anything else on the market. Spec Ops The Line actively challenged the shooter power fantasy. Dead Rising built an entire sandbox around systemic chaos. Enslaved prioritized narrative tone over mass market appeal. These weren't indie risks, they were funded risks. And that distinction matters. Because funded risks change design behavior. When a studio knows failure won't collapse the company, it experiments differently. The AA tier became a proving ground. New mechanics, hybrid genres, unusual art direction, narrative experimentation. Not all of them succeeded, but structurally they were allowed to exist. And that allowance is the key. Because the health of an industry isn't measured only by its hits, it's measured by what can it afford to try. Around the early 2010s, the cost curve bent upward sharply. Visual expectations escalated. Open worlds expanded. Facial animation demanded realism. Online infrastructure became baseline. Asset productions multiplied. Where one character model once required modest detailing, now it demanded photorealism. Voice acting moved from selective to cinematic. Cutscenes became filmic. Marketing budgets rivaled development budgets. And budgets climbed from 30 million to 80 to 120 and beyond. Here's the structural shift. When development costs triple, risk tolerance doesn't shrink linearly. It collapses. A failed $25 million project is disappointing. A failed $150 million project restructured companies. So publishers adapted. They consolidated focus around known quantities. Franchises became safer. Sequels became more iterative. Market research intensified. And mid-tier experimental projects, those $30–50 million risks, became difficult to justify. The cost curve didn't eliminate creativity, it reprioritized predictability. And predictability rarely lives in the middle. As costs rose, consolidation accelerated. Large publishers acquired smaller studios. Risk moved upward and decision moved toward financial modeling. Greenlight processes changed. Concepts weren't just evaluated on creative merit, they were evaluated through market data projections. Comparable franchise performance, retention estimates, monetization modeling, cross-platform viability. The industry became data literate, and data, by nature, favors predictability. AA games historically thrived on ambiguity. New IP, unproven mechanics, moderate expectations. But ambiguity is difficult to quantify, and in an era of rising budgets, quantifiable outcomes became king. Studios were no longer just creative entities, they were portfolio components. The middle tier didn't vanish because executives hated creativity, it vanished because risk algorithms don't like uncertainty, and the middle is uncertainty. As the middle weakened from above, something rose from below. Digital distribution removed gatekeepers. Indie development matured technically. Engines, like Unity and Unreal, democratized tools, and experimentation migrated. Narrative risk, indie. Mechanical experimentation, indie. Stylized art direction, indie. But scale shifted. AA once offered experimentation with production value. Indie offered experimentation with constraint. That difference matters. because production value affects audience reach. AA games could fail moderately and still remain visible. Indie games often succeeded spectacularly or disappeared quietly. The middle ones buffered volatile. Without it, the ecosystem polarizes, small and agile, or massive and entrenched, with very little in between. Then came the structural pivot. Games stopped being products, they became platforms. Live service altered financial logic entirely. Instead of selling 5 million copies once, publishers could generate recurring revenue indefinitely. But this required scale, infrastructure, server maintenance, content pipelines, monetization systems, community management. AA games were traditionally self-contained. Launch, support briefly, move on. Live service requires long-term commitment. So, capital flowed toward projects that could sustain ecosystems. Why fund 5 contained experiments when one scalable platform can generate predictable revenue for years? The answer isn't emotional, it's structural. Recurring models reward concentration, and concentration leaves little room for moderate one-time risks. When the middle tier shrank, something subtle changed in design evolution. AA games often tested hybridization, unusual pacing, genre blending, mechanics without franchise baggage. Without that buffer, experimentation either moves to indie, smaller scale, or must survive inside AAA, higher stakes. AAA experimentation becomes cautious. Indie experimentation becomes constrained. The middle ones allowed mid-scale iteration, and iteration is how genres evolve. RTS decline, shooter homogenization, open-world convergence. These aren't isolated phenomena, these are symptoms of structural compression. When the ecosystem narrows, design diversity narrows with it. Not instantly, but gradually. Yet, the story isn't purely decline. Subscription platforms are reintroducing funding models for mid-tier experiments. Publishers are cautiously greenlighting smaller scoped projects. Remakes and remasters reduce risks while maintaining moderate budgets. The middle may not look like it did in 2010, but fragments are re-emerging. Subsidized by ecosystems, supported by platform holders, conditionally revived. The question isn't whether AA returns exactly as it was. It's whether the industry can sustain a healthy middle long term. Because industries without a middle becomes brittle, over-reliant on blockbusters, dependent on volatility, and vulnerable to disruption. There was once a shelf. Top row, spectacle. Bottom row, niche. And in the middle, ambition without certainty. The AA game didn't collapse overnight. It was compressed by rising costs, by algorithmic risk, by live service economics, by consolidation. It didn't die because players stopped caring. It disappeared because the structure changed. And whether that middle returns may determine how creatively flexible the industry remains. New case files release every Monday, Wednesday and Friday.